September 22nd, 1979. South Indian Ocean. A cold, empty quadrant of water between Africa and Antarctica. Above it, high and tired, a weathered American satellite stared at the curve of the Earth and waited to be bored. It had been designed for boredom, an old Sentry launched a decade earlier, past its warranty, past its glamour, still doing the quiet arithmetic of light. Just before dawn, the satellite's two small eyes blinked. Not once, twice. NTHE first blink came like a punch. A sharp, bright spike that would have been over before an eyelid could finish deciding to close. The second followed after a breath, a slower, longer swell of light, less intense but wider, as if the sky inhaled what it had just exhaled. Two pulses separated by a shallow valley. The shape of that light was not random. It was a signature, a curve that engineers recognized the way doctors recognize heart rhythms. Somewhere below, if the curve meant what it had meant so many times before, a nuclear device had just gone off. NTHE satellite did not shout. It printed. Instruments that never get excited wrote down their excitement with numbers. The data went out the way all data go out, from the cold to a warm room where people squint and worry and start their sentences with if. NIF, the curve was true. The world had just changed in a place that had no witnesses. NBY, mid-morning, the light had become a rumor wearing a uniform. A teletype in a windowless watch center skated out a strip that said the word nobody wants to see in a routine: nuclear. Phones that normally lounge on desks learned their reason for existing. A small chain of people who understand what double pulses mean picked up pens and put them down again without writing, as if to keep their hands from doing anything dramatic. NTHE first task in such moments is always the most unglamorous. Make sure your eyes weren't tricked. The satellite's eyes were called bang meters, simple, stubborn sensors built to measure very fast changes in light. Nuclear explosions in the atmosphere or at the surface of the sea have a distinctive brightness curve. The first flash is the fireball, an almost instantaneous glare. Then the shockwave expands, becomes a shell, and briefly dims the fire behind it. As the shock thins and the fireball grows, the light rises again. That's the double flash. That's the signature. NEX, CEPT signatures can be forged by nature, by machine age, or by wishful thinking. The satellite that saw it had been in orbit since the late 60s. It had spent 10 years being cooked by sun and cold and vacuum. Parts learn to lie when they're that old. So the men and women who read the graph asked their first useful question: is this a real sky or a tired sensor inventing a story to feel important? They pulled the housekeeping telemetry, the space equivalent of a human's vital signs. Voltage, temperature, attitude. The numbers didn't point to a sick eye. Then they asked the second useful question: did the other eye see it? There were two bang meters, angled to minimize the chance that a glint or a cosmic prank would fool both at once. Both had registered the shape, not identical. The world never gives you identical, but close enough to rhyme. Down on Earth, a different set of eyes turned toward the ocean that had no people in it, toward a pair of tiny islands, windswept, volcanic, lonely, where the ocean flung South Africa up a pair of stepping stones called the Prince Edward Islands. Maps came out of drawers. Rulers set down great circle lines. The rough fix put the event in waters so empty they made a map look impolite. NTHE word traveled upstairs. It always does. In the White House, an administration already tired from a year filled with bad surprises. Heard the kind of, maybe that sounds like a shout, maybe a clandestine nuclear test. The President's Day acquired a new shadow. The room did what rooms do when they are small and the topic is large. It got quiet. There are two immediate paths in a case like this: science and politics. The science is, go find the traces. The politics is, decide what the traces would mean if you find them, and what they mean if you don't. Science first. If a device had gone off above the sea, even a small one, it was likely to leave stories behind. Whispers in the air, secrets dissolved in seawater, aftershocks written in the atmosphere's invisible layers. The orders went out to a special aircraft designed to drink air and taste it. Its job had an inelegant name, Sniffer, but the aircraft wore it without complaint. The plane lifted off from a base in the Indian Ocean and went hunting for radioactive daughters of a violent parent. Short-lived isotopes that act like signatures in a crime novel. If the plume was there to be found, and if the wind had not shredded it beyond recognition, the filters would catch it. But the ocean is a good paper shredder, and weather is an editor you can't bribe. They also went listening underwater. The planet carries ears in the sea, hydrophones that monitor the deep for the low thuds and long moans of things that humans drop or drive. A nuclear blast near the surface can make a sound the ocean can't help but repeat. Analysts pulled tapes, ran fingers along spectrograms, and looked for a shape that matched what the light claimed. Somewhere, on some channels, there were hints. Small thumps, ambiguous, because the ocean is full of ships and quakes and icebergs, calving like old men clearing their throats. Nothing you could take to a podium without inviting laughter from people who know the sea's sense of humor. They looked up too. Ionospheric stations, facilities that poke the sky with radio and listen for how it shimmers back, checked their logs for the minute when the light had misbehaved. Disturbances were noted by some, ignored by others, argued over by everyone, as is the custom in quiet branches of science, suddenly asked to referee an international incident. And they sent questions sideways. Weather satellites, lightning records, meteors. There are natural ways to throw light into a bang meter's eyes. A superbolt, one of those rare lightning strikes that arrives brighter than it has any right to be, can mimic parts of the curve, though not usually the curve itself. Meteors can flare and flare again. Sunlight reflecting off high clouds can lie to a tired sensor. Engineers, trained to hate coincidence and love failure modes, made lists of everything rude the sky could have done. And while science made its circles, politics sharpened its pencils. If the light was honest, who had a motive large enough to break a treaty and an ocean large enough to hide the breaking? The shortlist began short. South Africa, the apartheid regime that had dug test shafts in the Kalahari 2 years earlier before standing down under pressure, and Israel, widely suspected to have built a handful of weapons, and equally suspected to prefer that nobody ever see them. Alone, each had motives and constraints. Together, they had geography and discretion. One had access to a lonely quadrant of sea. The other had know-how and a habit of doing crucial things without applause. Rumor did the math. NTHE president convened a panel. That is not a euphemism. That is a tool. When ambiguity threatens to become policy, you grab scientists like reins. They were told what you always tell such panels. Be fast, be thorough, be boring in your certainty. The panelists knew the satellite's age, the ocean's tricks, the geopolitical calendar. They asked the engineers if a micrometeoroid could have slapped the sensor at just the right angle to make sunlight misbehave. They asked the meteorologists if a small carnival of high cloud and odd shadow could impersonate a bomb. They asked the Navy's listeners to swear, one way or the other, whether the sea had heard a bang. The answers felt like fog. Familiar, damp, full of shapes you could convince yourself were anything. Meanwhile, a quiet detail arrived from a place nobody expected to matter. A laboratory in the southern hemisphere reported finding a faint puff of a radioisotope in sheep that had been grazing under skies downwind of the empty ocean. The detection was late and light and not the kind of thing you hang a conclusion on. But it was another whisper, and whispers accumulate. Every yes had a maybe. Every maybe had a no. It was a buffet of ambiguity, and inside the government, memos began to split into two dialects. The analysts wrote one, full of probabilities and footnotes and the gentle arrogance of numbers that explain but do not decide. The policy people wrote the other, full of sentences shaped to survive headlines and hearings. The first dialect leaned toward a conclusion simple to say and hard to live with. A nuclear device probably went off. The second leaned toward caution. The evidence is not dispositive. The satellite may have erred. Both dialects were intelligent. Both were honest in their ways. They did not cancel each other. They constrained each other into a posture that diplomats could carry without blushing. In South Africa, microphones found denials prepared to travel. In Israel, microphones found silence, and the absence of words did its usual magic. Silence is a costume. It fits any story you hang on it. NTHE's story, however, could not live forever on rumor and the shape of a light curve. If you cannot show the world a mushroom cloud or a plume full of signatures, you live or die by your instrument's credibility. So attention turned, ruthlessly, to the satellite. Engineers opened its metaphorical skull. They studied 10 years of behavior in search of a superstition that could be promoted to a theory. A precise failure mode that would make an honest eye invent a lie at exactly that minute over exactly that patch of sea. A few engineers didn't just study, they fell in love with their own caution. They wanted the failure to exist because failures are fixable and secrets at sea are not. They found aging in the photodiodes. They found temperature histories that could, in theory, change sensitivities. They found a plausible chain in which a speck from space kissing the sensor's shield at the wrong moment would scatter just enough sunlight into the detector to draw a false flash. And then, as the speck moved on, or the geometry changed by a fraction, a second, slower rise that would look like the tail of a real event. Plausible, but not proven. In this kind of work, plausible is both a comfort and a trap. NTHE panel wrote its report. It did not accuse. It did not absolve. It concluded, carefully, bureaucratically, that the most likely explanation was not a bomb, but a sensor artifact or a natural phenomenon, while conceding that a clandestine test could not be excluded. It was the kind of conclusion that keeps doors open and arguments alive. It was also the kind of conclusion a president can live with if he must, because presidents live with the world as it insists on being, not as graphs wish it to be. NNOT, everyone agreed. In a quiet wing of another building, a handful of analysts stapled their own memo to a thicker folder. They tallied the light curve's uncanny similarity to known tests. They noted the two-sensor confirmation. They added the small noises in the ocean and the smaller sense in the air. They drew a line that ended in a word the other memo would not say as a verdict: detonation. They did not publish it to the world. They published it to the soul of the bureaucracy, where convictions go to pace in circles until a later moment lets them out. In the region itself, the sea did what seas do with evidence. It spread it thin. Waves forgot. Winds smoothed. Weeks later, a second sampling flight chased ghosts and found the usual mix of modernity's dust and nature's mischief. The world's attention, which can only sit still for so long, got up and went to stand in other rooms with other emergencies. NBUT, the double flash did not stop existing just because the agenda moved on. It lived in the minds of everyone who had to file something that week. It lived in the way certain officers looked at certain nations. It lived in training slides that reminded new analysts that the sky knows how to lie convincingly, and that the truth sometimes comes dressed as a glitch. For people outside the buildings, the story was simple in the worst way. Nobody could prove the thing that many suspected. For people inside, the story was complicated in the best way. The world had just staged a lesson in uncertainty management, and nobody had died of it. Procedures were tuned. Instruments were questioned politely, so they would not sulk. Coordination with allies who flew sniffers and floated ears was tightened by a millimeter, the millimeter that matters when reality moves the finish line by just as much. And yet, a question like this is not content to be shelved. It asks again. It asks in the background of other questions. When a ship radios a call sign that sounds wrong, somewhere in the mind of a watch officer there is a double flash. When a nation requests a satellite pass over a patch of water nobody cares about, somewhere in the mind of a planner, there is a double flash. When a rumor travels faster than it should, somewhere in the mind of a diplomat, there is a double flash. Because the shape of that light is a tattoo. Once you have seen it and understood what it might mean, you cannot unknow its curve. NWE are not done. A good story in the Cold War does not end with an inconclusive panel and an old satellite deciding to develop character. It continues in the paper trail, the follow-up flights, the quiet cables, the scientists who objected to their own conclusions a year later because new data had offended their pride. It continues in the way certain governments behaved in the seasons that followed, in their purchase orders, in their caution, in their lack of curiosity when curiosity would have been cheap. And it continues in a small and stubborn fact. The ocean cannot testify, but people can. And sometimes, years later, a person who knows where a briefcase slept for a week decides to talk. Sometimes, a record meant to stay sealed acquires a paperclip from someone who believes that ambiguity is a bad bedfellow for history. Sometimes, a note scribbled in a margin explains, better than any graph, why a president chose the sentence he did. NFOR now. We stand at the edge of a map, looking down at coordinates that do not have a lighthouse. We have a satellite's memory, a handful of maybes, and a world that behaved cautiously for once. That is not nothing. That is a kind of answer, NBUT to get the rest, the human weight behind the graphs. We have to walk the trail that reached outward from that minute in 1979, to the planes that sniffed and what they did and did not find, to the rooms where most likely wrestled with cannot rule out, to the capitals that had the motive and the means and the silence, to the scientists who would, years later, call a colleague and say, I have been thinking about that curve again. NWE will go there. We will put the numbers next to the people and ask them to share a chair. We will let uncertainty tell its story, and then we will see whether the world, which hates unclear endings, can live with one for a while longer. Hold that curve in your mind, the first bright punch, the second slower swell, and hold the map that refuses to put a name on that patch of water. Then, follow me into the rooms where the decision was made to call it an artifact, and the rooms where the decision was made to treat it like a warning anyway. NNTHE order that went out after the double flash was simple in the way that hard orders are simple. Look everywhere. The sniffer plane lifted and followed the wind like a hound. Filters the color of chalk gathered air by the ton, then turned it back into a few grams of dust that could make or break a story. Lab doors opened. Geiger counters woke up. The technicians, calm, dogged, methodical, cut each filter into pieces and put the pieces into machines that can hear atoms talk. There are certain daughters you hope never to meet. Iodine that shouldn't be there. Barium that only exists right after something violent has happened. Xenon that comes from a parent with a temper. The instruments listened for those daughters. In a few places, faintly, the ears perked up. Tiny upticks that could be fallout or could be the world's modern noise. Elsewhere, nothing. The readouts produced numbers just big enough to argue about. Under another ceiling, ocean tape spun. The globe wears microphones on the continental shelves. The deeper you listen, the slower the world talks. Analysts who have spent their lives telling icebergs apart from submarines by the taste of sound ran their fingers across the wiggles and looked for a thump that matched a weapon. A few traces were suggestive, none demanded belief. One station kept quiet because of maintenance. Another heard a far storm. A third heard a ship that insisted on being everywhere at once. That is how honest puzzles sound, messy, in the ionosphere, the high electrical skin of the planet. Some stations recorded a wink around the moment of the flash. Others saw nothing. The sky is a lazy witness. If it doesn't want to support you, it just shrugs. NSO the work returned, as it always does, to the long table where engineers sit with scientists and draw boxes on paper. If the event had been a clandestine test, someone with a motive and a budget had made a big decision. If it had not, an aging satellite had imitated a signature that was supposed to be unique. Both options were ugly in different ways. The panel on the case, clever, skeptical, allergic to drama, did the arithmetic. They interrogated the sensor's age. They simulated sunlight, bouncing off high cloud at weird angles. They imagined a tiny particle from space smacking the satellite in a way that would scatter a brief glare into its eyes, and then a second, slower swell as geometry changed by a whisper. They stacked maybes into a ladder tall enough to climb down from the word bomb without falling. Their report did not end with a drum roll. It ended with a sentence. The most likely cause was a natural or instrumental phenomenon. A nuclear test could not be excluded. It was, strictly speaking, an answer. It was also a compromise, one that protected policy from certainty it could not own. And inside the government, that sentence became a rule of posture. If you cannot prove it, you do not accuse. If you cannot rule it out, you do not forget. The watch officers were told to treat the double flash like a warning, even if the paper called it a glitch. That is not cowardice. That is craft. Beyond the paper, people behaved like the curve might be real. Quietly, procurement lists changed shape. Quietly, satellites got new eyes, new filters, better shielding, smarter thresholds, so a tired sensor could not improvise another story with that particular tune. The next generation didn't just look, it cross-examined. If one eye saw, another had to second the motion. If space claimed, air and sea had to nod. The doctrine bent away from single-point faith and toward corroboration as a reflex, not a courtesy. And all the while, the rumor that had been born with the light kept walking around the world, trying on different coats. One version wore South Africa's geography and Israel's silence, and claimed to be a joint test, staged where the world would least expect a witness. Another wore nature's robe and said lightning can be a prankster, meteors can double blink, high clouds can become mirrors when the sun is skimming the edge of the world. A third wore engineering fatigue and suggested the sensor had read its own pulse as if it were the skies. Each outfit fit just well enough to get through a doorway. None fit well enough to convince the whole room. And outside the rooms, the ocean kept its secret. A few weeks after the event, sheep thousands of kilometers downwind were tested. Some labs found a breath of iodine that looked like Fallout's ghost. Others did not. The results were debated, tunneled into, reanalyzed, footnoted, to within an inch of their lives. Science, asked to be judge and jury, did its best imitation of a hung jury. Careful, divided, honest. NTHE double flash migrated from the president's morning brief to the annexes of training manuals. It became a cautionary tale with numbers. Remember this curve, the manual said. Remember how sure it looked. Remember that certainty can be a costume. Remember how much it cost to be wrong, and how much it would have cost to be rash. Years walked by. Satellite names changed. Administrations changed. Some of the people at the table retired into the kind of quiet you earn by not making the world worse. Some did interviews with the gravity of witnesses testifying about a car crash nobody can prove. The words "most likely not" and "cannot rule out" kept each other company in paragraphs meant to outlast headlines. If you listened carefully, you could hear pride in not having been silly. Meanwhile, engineers refused to be bored. They built better bang meters, the kind that do not confuse the world's tricks for a weapons pulse. They hardened circuits, narrowed tolerances, improved background subtraction. They paired eyes with ears by default, not as an afterthought. They taught machines to distrust themselves in clever ways. If you see something alone, assume for a moment you are wrong. Ask a friend. Ask two. The machines learned modesty. It is one of the more beautiful traits to teach a tool. NTHAT is the technical legacy. The human legacy is different. The double flash taught a generation of analysts how to live with a phantom. It taught them to file the report that says maybe without flinching, and to keep an extra pot of coffee for the weeks when maybe becomes a lifestyle. It taught them to speak in sentences that survive both hearings and history. Precise, cautious, correct. It taught them, most of all, that you can make the right choice with incomplete information and still sleep at night. Because the right choice is not to bluff the world into coherence. The right choice is to treat ambiguity with respect and to build systems that are humble in the presence of doubt. NDID, a secret nuke, go off in the Indian Ocean in 1979? If what you want is a verdict that can be stamped on a plaque, The honest answer refuses to cooperate. If what you want is the shape of a responsible reaction, that we can deliver. The system checked, cross-checked, argued, documented, and improved itself. It treated the curve like a warning anyway. There is a kind of heroism in that unphotogenic arc. Nobody got a medal for revising a threshold. Nobody held a parade for the person who wrote the new rule that says one sensor never gets to start history on its own. But those acts have afterlives. They are the reason later alarms rang softer or not at all. They are the reason the next generation of satellites did not flinch at a lightning joke and call it Armageddon. Some stories demand an answer so hard they will accept a bad one. This story does not. This one asks you to live with the line between maybe and probably, and to respect the people who kept pointing at that line until it became part of doctrine. NSO, we end where we began, with a satellite that blinked twice in the dark and made grown governments stare at a map that had nothing on it but water and wind. With scientists who chose to be boring rather than theatrical. With engineers who redesigned the ways eyes work in space. With watch officers who, hearing the words "most likely," kept a hand near the phone but did not dial the number that wakes the world. Whatever happened that morning over the South Indian Ocean, it left us with a better question to ask the next time light behaves like a signature. Who else saw it? Who else heard it? Where is the daughter? Where is the wake? And until those answers arrive, keep the gate closed. Treat it like a warning anyway, because sometimes the bravest thing a system can say is not yes, not no, but not yet. And that is our ending. Not a mushroom cloud. Not a confession. Just a curve in the light that taught machines how to be modest and taught people how to make peace with not knowing everything before they decide anything. The world pivoted on that small lesson more than it did on any loud conclusion. NTHE satellite aged, fell silent, and burned up at last in an atmosphere that did not care about its memories. The ocean rolled over the coordinates where 100 arguments point. The files cooled, the stamps dried. But the doctrine stayed. Eyes must agree. Ears must agree. Numbers must agree. People must agree. Then, and only then, do you let a room full of phones become the fuse they were designed to be. NTHE light that shouldn't exist still exists in archives. The first spike, the second rise. It will visit training classes forever. It will make new analysts feel the old tingle in the back of their necks. And then it will make them do the most important thing adults who keep us safe ever do. Pause. NWE call that prudence. We call it professionalism. In the vocabulary of a long peace, it has another name, survival.